Hi, welcome to our CREST seminar here at our Centre for Research in Social and Psychological Transformation. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Kathryn Kissell tonight, who has done her doctoral studies here at the University of Roehampton as part of her Psych D in counselling psychology. Kathryn has an MA in experimental psychology from Oxford and an advanced diploma in theological studies from Trinity College in Bristol, and she's now in the final stages of writing up her Psych D dissertation. And her presentation tonight is entitled Burnout, a Relational Perspective.
Hi. Well, thank you all so much for coming. It's great to see you, and hello if you're watching over the internet. I won't look at you directly. It feels very strange to look directly into a video camera, so I hope you forgive me. But hopefully you'll be able to see all the PowerPoints and you'll be able to engage with us. So, so thank you, Edith. I'm Kathryn Kissell, and I'm going to offer some thoughts tonight about burnout from a relational perspective. I'm going to consider the impact of a relational intervention on well-being, and it's based on my Psych D research, which was exploring the impact of Wellbeing group systems coaching on clergy work-related psychological health. So, to start with, we're going to look at an overview of burnout with a focus on the relational element. Then I'm going to introduce Bowen family systems theory and its relevance for work-related psychological health. And I actually brought a few books with me tonight, so you're very welcome to have a little look at before you go. And finally, we'll provide an overview of the current study exploring Bowen coaching as a resource for clergy well-being. Do come on in. No, don't worry, it's fine. So, burnout was first observed by Freudenberger and Maslach in the 1970s. And this is Freudenberger's quote, that burnout was a state of mental and physical exhaustion caused by one's professional life. Freudenberger was a psychiatrist working with volunteers in a free community clinic in New York. And Maslach was a social psychologist who was studying human services workers in California and looking at their response to emotional pressures in the workplace. And the term burnout, like this match, captures metaphorically the extinguishing of energy experienced by these workers, where once they had passion and fire for their work and that was burning brightly. Now all that was left was an experience of emotional depletion, a loss of motivation, negative feelings about clients, and a crisis in professional competence. It's a real erosion of the spirit. So while burnout was initially identified within human services workers, over time, by the end of the 1980s, it became clear that burnout was being experienced in other professions. And this led to a broadening of the concept. So it's seen as a state of exhaustion where one is cynical about the value of one's occupation and doubtful about one's capacity to perform. And Maslach developed the Maslach burnout inventory that captures these three distinct elements: exhaustion, cynicism, and inefficacy. So over time, it became clear that actually burnout needed to be encompassed within the whole picture of stress. And actually it can be considered the last act of the stress cycle, which gradually develops over a period of years of chronic exposure to occupational stress that causes an unmitigating overproduction of cortisol. The emotional exhaustion element is the personal individual stress response. It can be considered a breakdown of the intrapsychic self-regulatory stress management system. And that might be what we recognise in terms of feeling utterly exhausted, not being able to sleep, and deficits in memory and attention. This then progresses and develops into cynicism. And that's an increasing hostility, irritation, and conflict experienced with others. And this might be understood as the breakdown of the normative interactive co-regulation of stress using attachment figures, so the way we manage stress with other people. And then efficacy encapsulates those feelings of incompetence, lack of achievement, and self-blame. So the counterbalance to this very negative view of work-related psychological health began in the 1990s with the development of the positive psychology movement. And they defined their quest as enhancing the flourishing or optimal functioning of people, groups and institutions. Rather than attempting to avoid burnout, the question began to be how to encourage well-being within the workplace. And the idea of particularly of work engagement emerged, an enthusiastic and an energetic enthusiasm for work, which of course we hold all of the time. So originally, burnout and work engagement were understood to be two ends of a continuum, but what's become clear is that actually they function quite independently. So clergy, for example, have been found to be at very high risk of burnout with high levels of work exhaustion, but this is offset by equally high levels of work engagement. So one doesn't dismiss the other. And increasingly, exhaustion and cynicism, those first two elements of burnout, are seen as the fundamental parts, whereas efficacy belongs more over to the work engagement side. So, the prevalence of burnout. Since Maslach and Frunberger's first definitions, there's become increasing concern about the state of psychological health within the workplace. And the Health and Safety Executive within the UK last year now reported that 49% of all working days lost to ill health are due to work-related stress, depression or anxiety. By occupation, those public service industries, particularly healthcare workers, show significantly high levels of stress, as you can see up here. And mental health services have the greatest sickness absence in the NHS. In fact, such is the concern about the psychological health of those professions in the NHS that a charter has recently been published by the BPS and the new Savoy Partnership that calls for a greater focus of support on staff wellbeing through the development of a more compassionate workplace. High levels of stress are recognised as eroding compassion that not only affects the staff but affects clients' quality of care. So, what do we do about it? Well, I can tell you something in my research, that there are literally thousands and thousands of research papers on what causes burnout, the etiology of it, describing it till the cows come home. But there is very, very little on interventions. Where the intervention started was person-centred interventions, so that's on oneself, and on strengthening physical and psychological resilience, CBT work, mindfulness groups, developing coping strategies. In reality, it's much easier to run individual interventions, and it's also much cheaper. But what became clear as the research continued is that while they can be helpful, they don't fundamentally often deal with the root causes, and that led to the development of an organisational level interventions. And they focus on improving the job person fit, so the congruity between the organisational structures and the employee needs. And so successful partnerships involve the two employers working closely together, identifying particular issues that are going on within the workplace, and then developing a response. For example, staff recognition programs, so that help people feel increased reward, or increased transparency in decision making, so fairness is increased within the workplace. Both two issues that affect well-being. So the impact of both these interventions can be seen within the job demands resources model, where good work is work that produces flourishing within the workplace. But that doesn't mean reducing all sources of stress. What it means is balancing the experience of challenging demands by ensuring sufficient resources. So what we can see with organisational strategies is that by trying to improve the work environment, they can reduce demands and increase resources for their workers. And individual strategies can work to increase resources, so for example developing coping strategies. But they also operate at the seesaw, the pivot point, because stress is not only the sum of the pressures that you're experiencing, it's also your interpretation of them. So individual interventions like CBT can act at that pivot point about the translation of stress into something that becomes detrimental to you. So at this point, everything feels terribly practical and functional, with lots of inputs and outputs, and relationships really feel quite superfluous to the whole thing. However, one of the recent publications by some of the leading researchers in the field, including Maslach, has called for a refocus on the relational dimension. Because, of course, the primacy of relationships was right there at the start. Burnout was first recognised within human services professionals. And cynicism, the element that distinguishes burnout from stress, is a fundamentally social construct. Interestingly, while the definition of burnout broadened over time, the actual experience of working within the workplace has become increasingly relational, as organisational structures are flattening out and there's increasing group work. And as Elizabeth Cotton writes in her guide to surviving work in health and social care, she says, in order to survive work, we all need to build our relationships with the people around us. Now, I imagine that I'm talking to a great deal of therapists. In fact, I know I am, therapists or trainee therapists here. And to you, this is going to come as no surprise, the importance of relationship. Because the relational term that has gone on within psychotherapy over the recent years identifies the role of relationships as fundamental, both to mental health and to therapeutic interventions. Not only has psychotherapy been impacted by the intersubjective term within philosophy, that idea that we're fundamentally being in relation, that we exist within our relationships to others rather than the Descartesian ideas of individualism. But also the psychotherapy research, a little nod to Mick over here, is that the client-therapist relationship is regarded as a crucial common factor promoting therapeutic change. Additionally, there's an increasing evidence that the role of interpersonal difficulties is within the etiology of anxiety and depression, and therapeutic interventions focusing on interpersonal relationships are developing, such as DIT and interpersonal psychotherapy. The relational term has impacted almost every school of psychotherapy. We've got the relational psychotherapy, we've got the relational shift in person-centred psychotherapy, the emphasis within existential psychotherapy, and even within transactional analysis. So the emphasis is on the relationship between the client and the therapist as bidirectional. So the therapist's own historical relational patterns are interacting with the client's own experiences. And it's the co-created mutual encounter which is identified as the central mode of healing. So relationships wound and relationships heal. So if we revisit the demands and resources model with our relational antennae, we notice the dominance of relational factors. So one of the most widely used measures of stress within the UK is the Health and Safety Executives measure. And 3 out of their 7 factors are relational. It's about management support, it's about peer support, and it's about relationships in general. And when you look here, I imagine that some of them can be quite predictable, ideas about conflict and bullying, but others might be more unusual, ideas of nurturance, which means the experience of giving and receiving to others, and fairness, which includes relational justice. And there's also some factors here that could act as demands or resources. So a lack of management support is a demand, yet receiving management support is a resource. And even some factors that feel initially quite practical, such as role ambiguity or unrealistic expectations, can be understood within the dynamic of boundaries. So our capacity to form boundaries in relation to others. So given the importance of relational factors in psychological health, again, it shouldn't be surprising, but it still feels surprising that there are hardly any interventions into the impact of improving working relationships. And those that do exist, come on in, focus on very specific elements of the relational experience. So there's an organisational intervention called CREST, which focuses on the issue of social discourse. And there's some research on an assertiveness training, I think that's in Italy, with mental health workers. And both of those show positive results. But I want us just to think about drawing on some of those ideas from the relational psychotherapy, what has happened to thinking about the co-created encounter? You can see them working out what to do. Can I pull the rope? And what's going to happen if I do? So while interpersonal relationships are the focus of the intervention, the approach continues to be essentially individualistic. So you alter your communication style to improve your psychological health. There's no mention of the impact on another and the fact that those impacts can be positive and can be negative. Nor is there any mention of the repetition in the here and now of our past relational experiences. And I think that these factors make relational change much harder. So often we know what we ought to do. We can give the advice to our clients, but it's much harder to put it into practice ourselves. So I think about someone I know who's incredibly frustrated by her lazy boss. It's producing symptoms of stress and burnout in her. And she's starting to reenact the over-functioning patterns that she had as a child. But she can't challenge her boss because she's frightened because of what her experiences as a child with her father. So, having thought a little bit about burnout and its context within work-related psychological health and the idea of relationships as important for well-being, I would like to explore with you the potential role of Bowen's systems theory and coaching as a relational resource to prevent work burnout and support psychological health. So out of interest, has anyone in this room met any of Murray Bowen's ideas? You have a little bit, nice, great, yeah. So this is he. Bowen trained as a classical Freudian psychoanalyst, and he fully developed and articulated his ideas about systems theory while he was working at the National Institute of Mental Health in Bethesda in the 1950s. And he was there observing the relationships between adult women with schizophrenia and their families. Interestingly, it started between the women and their mothers, and then expanded out to include the whole family. So, Bowen is a first-generation family therapist, and this family therapy has developed. In some cases, it looks very different now, but an awful lot of family therapy in America still uses his ideas, and he's also very influential within couple therapy in America. And in contrast with much of our thinking in today's mental health, Bowen didn't see psychological difficulties as residing in individuals. Instead, he shifted the unit of therapeutic analysis from the individual to the family system, seeing individuals as merely the identified patient of a struggling, intergenerational relational system. So rather than prescribing specific symptom-reducing interventions, he focused on identifying the active and dynamic process of mutual and reciprocal interactions and flow within the system of the family as a whole. And his theory, he proposed, works at both a family and a societal level. He understands symptoms as existing along a continuum and resulting from the natural expression of anxiety within the system. So anxiety he understood as a natural product in the process of living. He saw chronic anxiety as a driving force of life, flowing about us all the time and stemming from uncertain circumstances and intense relationships. When anxiety is low, we can process our situations thoughtfully and make rational decisions. But as our anxiety increases, we become less able to think and more emotionally reactive. And Bowen was particularly interested in the way our anxiety rubs off on people, the way we catch it, and the way families have their own unique ways of spreading it around. So my daughter, who was 5 at the time, turned to me one day and she said to me, "When you're stressed, you get angry at Daddy. Daddy then gets annoyed at Zach, who's her big brother, and Zach gets annoyed at me, and then I get angry at you." So that was our family system that she observed, that pattern, how our anxiety flowed amongst us. And we go and repeat those patterns of behaviour. So those patterns that develop within our families become fixed and predictable over time. And we unconsciously assign roles to each family member, whether it's the peacemaker who tries to diffuse the family conflicts, or the distancer who withdraws when caught up in family worries, swiftly followed by the pursuer who deals with anxiety by seeking closeness and agreement, or the over-responsible child who is counted on to always do the right thing and serve as an extra parent. But it doesn't stop within the family system, because those responses become so instinctual that we use them in other environments when pressure or anxiety rises. Effectively, we replicate them in our working life. So these are Bowen's 8 key concepts, and I don't have time to go into them today, but I've put down at the bottom the website at the Bowen Centre, which offers fantastic definitions of all of them. But the one I am going to focus on is at the top: differentiation of self. So, differentiation captures our behavioural and emotional functioning when we are under pressure, whether that be due to uncertain circumstances or intense relationships. One's level of differentiation is on a continuum, and it's established in childhood within one's family of origin. And it encapsulates 2 elements: the individual dimension and the relational dimension. Someone with a higher level of differentiation has the capacity to hold thoughtfully acquired principles that have been established through one's own internal decision-making. They haven't just been adopted from somebody else. And someone with a high level of differentiation is capable of thinking through a situation without being drawn to act by the emotional responses of either themselves or somebody else. But importantly, that doesn't mean being cut off from your emotions. It means being aware of them, but not emotionally reactive, which is much easier said than done. And then, on the other side, is the relational dimension. So at a fundamental level, Bowen understood the human experience as a journey of balancing 2 seemingly opposing forces, that of self-definition and relatedness. So self-definition is the quest to achieve and maintain a coherent and essentially positive sense of self. But relatedness is the desire to form and maintain stable and reciprocal relationships. And both of us tend towards one or other of these poles, but good mental health requires balancing them both. And I have a little quick remote control test to tell you which side you tend towards. So if you think about walking into your lounge, you've got all your family there. Are you the person who grabs the remote control, chooses the channel and sits back and relaxes? Or are you the person like me who really doesn't want the remote control? And if I do have to have the remote control, really wants everybody in the room to agree on what we're going to watch before I press any buttons. So you can tell that I might tend towards the relational dimension. So someone with a high level of differentiation holds the capacity to articulate their own personal beliefs and maintain their integrity while allowing others to do the same, without controlling them, without conforming to their ideas, or without cutting off and withdrawing, even when emotions are running really high. So Bowen understands these individual and relational challenges to be at the heart of psychological health and distress. And he turned his therapeutic intervention coaching. And its aim is to assist clients to increase their levels of differentiation. It's a 3-fold approach. It involves learning about those core concepts in the theory. Then it involves taking those ideas and applying them to your personal life. He did it generationally, so he understood family systems as going down at least through 3 generations. So you would plot your genogram, and you would plot the patterns and methods of relating throughout those generations and how they've carried on through. But also it was developing the idea of becoming a researcher in your own family. So going back, like my daughter, seeing what was going on. How am I responding? How are we all playing a dance together? There's a few points that I really wanted to highlight because Bowen's approach is in some ways similar and in other ways very distinct from other approaches. His model really is interactionally focused and not problem focused. So the issue is misted out to concentrate on the surrounding anxiety-induced anxiety-driven automatic patterns of relating. It's practical and not emotional. The work is deeply emotional, but the focus is to go out and do something different in your relationships. Oh, sorry. The coaching works with the most motivated person or the most responsible, not the most symptomatic. So frequently in his work with families, it wouldn't be, for example, if the child was expressing the symptoms, it wouldn't be the child in the room. He would tend to work with the parent and the one who was most motivated, because it works within the idea of systems. So if one person changes, all others who are in emotional contact with them are likely to make compensatory changes too. It's outward focused and not focused within the therapeutic dyad. So unlike other approaches, the loci of change is not in the therapeutic relationship. It's encouraging change in the pre-existing relational systems, particularly one's nuclear family and one's family of origin. And interestingly, even in coaching in the workplace, the patterns of relationships that are often focused on are those from your family of origin, because in a way, your patterns of relating in your workplace are reflective of those from your family of origin, but your family of origin ones are the ones that are jolly hard to change. So if you can create change there, change in the rest of your relationship patterns is going to be much easier. However, the coaching is recognised as co-created and not individualistic. So Bowen found that his trainees made significantly more progress when he coached them to change their relationships in their own family of origins, rather than just focusing on clinical work. So the therapists were being pulled to replay their historical relational patterns, whether that's the over-responsible, the sacrificial, or the rescuer, and they were replaying them in the therapeutic relationship. So as those therapists worked on increasing their own differentiation, so they released their clients to do the same. And although some of those elements feel very distinct from other approaches, someone like Olson, I've got a few of his books over there, has found a way to employ them together with cohorts of self-psychology, seeing them as different lenses through which to look at the complexity of human experience. So, the relevance to burnout. Here we are. So Bowen explicitly applied his ideas of his theory to the workplace. He said the basic patterns in social and work relationships are identical to the relational patterns in the family, except in intensity. And he proposed that rather than seeing stress as some quantitative notion of overwork, it's more about your position in the organisation's anxious relational system. So in times of chronic anxiety, when there's heightened practical or relational demands, individuals with lower levels of differentiation will find themselves expressing increased fusion behaviours. They might feel that they're merging with their role, that there's no capacity to obtain a work-life balance any longer. Or they might find themselves becoming chameleon-like, accommodating to other people in order to gain acceptance or approval. Or the opposite, becoming quite bullying and dogmatic and pressurising others to conform so we can all have the same emotional experience, not able to hold that balance of me having my own self-differentiated self and you and me maintaining my connection with you. And all those behaviours are emotionally draining. They lead to exhaustion. Ultimately, they lead to relational withdrawal and ultimately cut off. The symptoms of burnout. So coaching to increase one's differentiation focuses on increasing your ability to manage yourself based on your principles and not on your emotional reactions, and helps you avoid getting caught up in groupthink. So such changes support individual adjustments. There can be an increased sense of control, maintenance of more appropriate boundaries, but that capacity to offer a greater calm and non-anxious presence, a greater non-anxious presence, not a completely non-anxious presence, infiltrates then the whole system. So other people are able to calm themselves. It reduces the systemic anxiety and people become less caught up in the emotional process that's going on and become more able to think. And what you see within organisations is there's less blaming, there's less scapegoating, there's less conflict, and individuals are able to share and explore differing opinions together, which often means, often Bowen, coaches are brought in when organisations are stuck, they can't think any longer. And opening that up allows more creativity. And differentiation within an organisation particularly works with those in leadership positions. Because, like a family, the one in the most responsible position, it acts like their style creates like a chain reaction that flows throughout the whole organisation. So, what's the empirical research? Well, the research is generally from America, where Bowen is very well known. And there's not a huge literature, but the cross-sectional research suggests that differentiation, as we would expect from the theory, is negatively correlated with burnout and stress, including those specific factors as well. And while, until my research, no one had looked at the relationship between differentiation and work engagement, it has been found to be positively correlated with job satisfaction and increased satisfaction with working relationships, working conditions, and even increased organisational commitment. So, what is the role of differentiation within that demands and resources model? So the quantitative research, which I've done little stars, you probably can't see from back there, the quantitative research has identified that it works to change the interpretation of events as stressful. So the same experience will be experienced as less stressful by people with a greater level of differentiation. And it also increases one's internal resources. So people with greater differentiation use different coping strategies. And people with increased differentiation also engage differently with their relationships, and they're more likely to see relationships as positive resources rather than demands. The qualitative research highlights some of these issues on this side with the demands, so that people find themselves more able to set boundaries and an enhanced ability to manage interpersonal demands, so they can manage issues like conflict more easily and more positively. So, what has all this got to do with clergy? Well, clergy, although you might not think of it, are fundamentally a human services professional. Their role is absolutely relational, and they regularly deal with the breadth of human experience. They can be dealing with the excitement of an upcoming marriage and then walk straight into planning a funeral and everything in between. Like mental health services, they are also under increasing pressure from reduced finances and increasing client or congregational expectations. However, they have none of the boundaries that we would expect to work as therapists. They have no start or end time to their day. They have clients who live down their road. They have a house which is next to their place of work and owned by their employer. Then typically add in having no professional supervision, and until recently they didn't even have job descriptions. So, as you might expect, the rates of stress and burnout are increasing within clergy. And in a strikingly similar move to the BPS Charter, plans are underway within the Church of England to draw up a covenant for clergy wellbeing. It was Edwin Freeman, whose book is over there, Generation to Generation, which is fantastic, who first applied Bowen's ideas to clergy and congregational systems. He recognised the church as an emotional system that acts in predictable patterns when facing pressure or anxiety. And he saw that clergy are under particular pressure because they're balancing their involvement in three interlocking emotional systems: congregational families, their own nuclear family, and the denominational family. In addition, clergy are under increasing pressure to define themselves by their role, that nature of the vocation, that you're always on the job. You aren't yourself anymore, you are your role. And Freeman's use of Bowen theory offered a completely different way of thinking about congregational leadership, towards developing one's strengths and becoming what he called a self-differentiating leader. So this led to my research rationale. So previous research projects have focused on the impact of Bowen coaching on clergy, which looked at the congregational leadership style. But of course, Bowen coaching was originally intended to improve psychological health, to offer it offers a theoretical framework to understand the impact of stress and response to relational demands within the workplace. So my question was whether Bowen coaching might be a relevant response to support clergy wellbeing. And so this was the title of my research, Exploring the Impact of Bowen Systems Coaching on the Work-Related Psychological Health of Church of England Clergy. And it was a longitudinal control group intervention design, there you go, employing quantitative measures with self-selecting participants. I'm aware of the time, I'm going to get with it now. So the hypotheses were, so I had a control group, but also it was a longitudinal design, so I had start and end measures. So the hypotheses were that the Bowen coaching group, by the end of their experience of the coaching, would show an increased differentiation of self and role, an increased experience of work-related psychological health, a decrease in their perception of work pressures, so the pressures might not have changed, but they would experience a decrease of pressure, and an increase in their experience of supportive relationships. So at that point, the only training in Bowen systems for clergy in the country was a 3-day residential course. However, Bowen's coaching that he developed for clinicians was a monthly coaching program. So the idea is that you learn the theory and then you apply it. So I was fortunately able to, they were very generous and let me use their material and then let me change the structure of it to form 6 sessions that we held monthly. So from September 2016, the study ran 3 coaching groups in 3 different dioceses around the country that met for 6 half-day sessions over a 7-month period. So we had 3 different Church of England dioceses who hosted, financed and recruited the participants. The groups were around 6 to 8 self-selecting participants, and they generally kept the inclusion criteria, which is full-time stipendiary parochial clergy. So they are clergy who are paid to do their job and work in the parish. And we also had a control group. Now, to have enough power, the idea was that we had 20 people in each group. And theoretically, it looked like we almost achieved that. However, when we actually looked at the number of people who actually completed both the start and the end surveys, it took us down an awful lot, which meant that we didn't have sufficient power to necessarily find the meaningful change that might have been there. So we also used effect sizes to quantify differences between groups. We looked at, I used measures that looked at Bowen's concept of differentiation, work-related psychological health, work pressure, both general organisational pressures and ministry-specific, and also I looked at the experience of relationships. The survey was completed 3 times, although the Bowen coaching group was the only one to complete the midpoint survey. And actually that didn't add a lot to our understanding, so I'm not pulling that in to the results today. And at the start, we obviously compared the 2 groups, and really they were, thankfully, very well matched. The only thing that was of note was that the control group was slightly more engaged with work than the coaching group, but also what was relevant was that it was a self-selecting sample. So we didn't get a clinical group. We got people who showed low levels of burnout and low levels of spiritual dryness and were generally quite engaged. It simply wasn't possible to try and draw out a clinical group, but the consequence of that is obviously that we're not going to see as much change because generally they're doing a little bit better. So the preliminary data analysis, the Cronbach's alphas were acceptable, the psychometric properties indicated the normality of distribution, and no demographic variables affected the results, so we didn't include them in any further analysis. This has got lots on it, hasn't it? Right, so the important things is that this is looking at the change in the Bowen group from start to finish. So the first thing that we saw was that there was a significant increase in differentiation for those who involved in the coaching group. And this was particularly related to fusion with role and fusion with other people. What we saw is they maintained their low levels of burnout and high levels of work engagement, but we did see that their spiritual dryness decreased. And then interestingly, in terms of measures of work pressure, they experienced a decrease in the organisational measures of work pressure. They also experienced a decrease in the frequency of ministerial demands. That's things like how often does someone contact you in the middle of the night, or expect you to do things that are very ministerially specific, but quite beyond what you'd normally expect within a role. But not only did the frequency of ministry demands decrease, there was a significant decrease in the intensity of those demands. So they weren't as stressful. And when compared to the control group, what we noticed is that actually while we were kind of just assuming that the Boeing group would just keep their relatively low levels of burnout and high levels of work engagement, actually the control group dropped their level of work engagement during the course of the research. So the Boeing group, who started off less work engaged, ended up equally as engaged with their work. There was no change in the control group for differentiation. And within the work pressures, again, the control group didn't change their experience of work pressures. And although they had slightly less frequency of ministerial demands, the severity of those demands remained the same. So they were just as intense and just as difficult to manage. This is a nice little graph just for you, to show the little change in differentiation that we got in the coaching group, which is great. And then the relational changes. So what we saw overall is a positive shift in the way relationships at work were viewed and interacted with. And that positive shift affected not only their working life but also their home life. So what we can see is that there was an improvement in all the relational measures within the health and safety executive scale: management support, peer support and congregational relationships. There was also an increase in the experience of support from members of the congregation. So I'm sure that their congregation didn't all turn around and suddenly start becoming really helpful. There was something about the coaching that enabled them to access and relate to the support that was being offered rather than feel that it was just being draining. And then the impact of work on home life, there was a significant reduction for the coaching group at the negative impact of work on home life. That was particularly noticeable at the start of the survey. It really was quite a negative experience for them. That significantly reduced, and the positive impact work had on home life also increased, whereas there was no change in the control group. We asked an open-ended question about what was the key area of impact. Great. For the participants. And what was really interesting was that obviously within these kind of groups you might expect some non-specific benefits. It's great all meeting together. It's just great being encouraged by each other. But actually, the areas of impact, they again and again mentioned Bowen's ideas within what was most important to them. And they divided really into the individual experiences and changes in the relational dimension of differentiation. So you can see here some of the quotes that I had a greater awareness of how and why people might act the way they do. I found that I can be rooted in who I am, and that encourages others to do the same. I can accept that conflict is inevitable and I take it less personally, and I'm able to boundary my time better. And boundary would never have been talked about explicitly within the coaching. So strengthening oneself enabled them to do that. Within the relational dimension, they found that their pastoral care capacity was strengthened. They were able to maintain a clear sense of self in the middle of conflict. Conflict was a massive issue that came out for people. It really hurt. And so it really helped them manage that better and keep in touch with people better as they were travelling through it. Getting better at responding to bullying and feeling a more confident resource and more able to be constructive with others. So this was some of the feedback that they they wished they'd had access to it earlier in their ministry, and they felt that it was something that should be made more available to others. So, we obviously have the difficulties of a small sample size and a non-clinical sample. However, the results do indicate that Bowen coaching does increase differentiation. And while the original hypothesis that work-related psychological health would increase was not fully supported, the results do offer tentative support for Bowen coaching, reducing that perception of work pressure and increasing the experience of positive relationships. So we can see that as acting on the seesaw and acting in the resources dimension. And some of those qualitative comments you can see being around boundary setting and an enhanced ability to manage interpersonal demands. So, at the start, I introduced the fact that burnout and psychological health are affected by relational factors that act as both an individual and an organisational level. The study suggests that Bowen coaching is an acceptable relational intervention that addresses both these elements. And the results indicate that Bowen coaching lays the foundation for improved psychological well-being in the longer term by reducing demands, increasing resources, and positively adjusting the perception of work pressures. So strengthening one's level of differentiation through Bowen coaching may be regarded as a potentially effective preemptive clinical intervention. And it might be reasonable to suggest that Bowen coaching would have a similar positive impact for other professionals, particularly those in relational roles. There you are.
Thank you so much for this, and I think we've got a job for you. I just want to say thank you to everyone who's watched us on Facebook or on the video that will be uploaded, and to say that our next, before we go to questions and answers, our next CREST seminar will be on the 26th of April, and we will have Sarah Cantwell talking about therapist and client interactions, responsiveness at the micro-interactional level in pluralistic therapy. And I hope you will join us then. Thank you very much. So, now we have some time, a little bit, 10 minutes for questions.